Last week, I made a video called Does the Key of Music Even Matter? And in less than a week, it became the highest viewed video on my channel. So I just wanted to say thank you for the support. It really means a lot. Some of the comments pointed out a few things I missed or could have explained better, and so I'd like to go over a few of those things here. If you haven't seen the original video, check that out first and come back. The link is in the description. To summarize quickly, yes, I do think the key that music is written in matters. Before equal temperament, different keys had different interval tunings and thus actually sounded different from one another. After equal temperament, keys lost all of their tuning characteristics because now they are all tuned exactly the same way. My argument was that key still does matter, even after equal temperament, because of the practicality and timbre of the instruments that interpret the music. But some excellent counter-arguments were brought up, so let's take a look. At one point in the video, I mentioned that key does not matter for electronic instruments, but some good comments made me look into this further. When I was speaking about electronic instruments, I was thinking something along the lines of MIDI inputs, like what I do in Sibelius. The practicality of inputting notes into Sibelius pretty much doesn't exist. I can put something in that is completely impossible to play on an actual instrument, and the computer will spit it back out no problem. For example, what I didn't take into account is that the speaker that has to interpret the sound and spit it out is essentially its own instrument, and thus key does matter when writing for electronic instruments, just as it would for any other instrument. There are specific ranges of frequencies that will sound best both on audio amplifiers and headphones, and this has to be taken into account when writing electronic music. For example, let's say if you want to write bass-heavy music that might be played at a nightclub. Most consumer audio systems bottom out at around the 30 to 40 Hz range. So it is important to pick a key that is high enough to be heard through standard audio systems, but still low enough to pack the punch that the music is looking for. These keys would likely be too low, and these keys would likely be too high. The keys of G and A seem to be the sweet spot. The human ear also has a bottom limit of what it can hear. The range is typically from 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz, but this range shrinks quickly with age. The key should both reflect the audio system's sweet spots and the limitations of human hearing. Thanks for pointing out that mistake. It was an interesting thing to learn about. Another good point that was brought up a few times was the idea of key changes. If the initial key doesn't matter, then the key changes shouldn't matter either, right? Well, no. The original key is important, but I'd argue that key changes are even more important. In general, humans are not great at recognizing absolute pitch without some kind of reference. It is rare that you can play a random note for someone and they can name that note accurately on the spot. And the same thing applies to single notes, chords, and keys. Most people cannot identify the key of a piece without reference. People that can either have perfect pitch or some kind of pitch memory, which we'll go into a little more later. But again, this is rare. However, humans are very good at recognizing the relationship between pitches, and this is called relative pitch. Almost everyone has some kind of relative pitch, whether you have training or not. For example, if you hear this sound, and then you hear this sound, you can easily recognize that the first pitch is lower than the second, even though you don't know the exact pitches. Musicians will train this skill to the point where we can recognize all of the different relationships between pitches, and we call them intervals. And again, this applies to chords and keys as well. All of this to say you probably won't know exactly what key you are in right away, but you will definitely recognize when there is a change in key, just as you would when there's a change in pitch. For example, let me know in the comments if you notice when the key changes. Most people without musical training would be able to identify that the key changed at some point, even without knowing the original key. People with strong relative pitch, which is far fewer than the first group, would be able to identify that the key changed from a tonic major to a subdominant minor, but likely wouldn't know specifically what the original key was. And people with perfect pitch would immediately identify the first part of the piece in C major and the second part in F minor. And this, of course, is even far fewer than both the other groups. And the last thing I wanted to touch on is pitch memory. Pitch memory is a phenomenon that occurs when someone is so familiar with a particular sound or piece of music, they are able to memorize the absolute pitch of it and recall it without a reference, even without possessing normal perfect pitch. This usually only happens after hearing something many times over a long period of time. For example, let's say your favorite song is in the key of C, and you have listened to this song hundreds or thousands of times multiple days per week for years. More than likely, you would notice immediately if there was a change in key. even if it was just by a half step. This can be seen in the last video's comments as well. For the intro, I used Mozart's Eine kleine Nacht music, which most people are very familiar with, but I played it in the wrong key. And several people were able to pick up that something was off right from the beginning. And this is likely due to them having some sort of pitch memory in regards to that particular piece of music. But if you heard a song once, and then you heard it again a month later, and the key was changed by a half step, you probably wouldn't notice. Pitch memory can also sometimes happen to instrumentalists who have spent a very long time playing their instrument. Some people call it poor man's perfect pitch. You become so familiar with the sound or timbre of your instrument that you start to memorize absolute pitches that have a similar timbre to your own instrument. For example, string players may be able to memorize the absolute pitch of their open strings. Wind players may memorize their tuning note. Brass players may memorize their fundamentals, etc. And to these people, key may matter more than to others because they already have a reference in their head at all times. Based off of this reference, they will likely be able to identify other pitches and keys using relative pitch, and thus will be able to tell quickly when something is off. There's much more to be said on this topic, and I know I didn't get into everything. Maybe I'll do a part 3 at some point. I thought I'd just show my face here quickly at the end to say thank you again, and to prove that I'm not an AI chatbot. I got accused of that a couple times. I'll try to stop talking so fast. See you next week.